We'll go ahead and get started, and as folks join in, they will join in. So we're on our second session of looking at Pirkei Avot, and for those who did not come to the first session, you will discover that we did not get very far through the text. That was by design. Each of these is still going to be an hour, and today we're going to get through even less text in some ways, but more text in others, which will make sense when we get there. Um, and so I just wanted to, before we got started, recap some of the roadmap and basics from last time, and then continue on from there into the new material. Um, we're not going to cover a huge amount of ground in Pirkei Avot today. We're really only going to look at one Mishnah, one chunk of Avot, but there's a lot that's happening in Pirkei Avot, and the the unit of it that we'll look at today actually tells us a lot about what the rabbis cared about with this text and will give us some insights into some of the limits on the translations we might use. So we'll actually get a chance to see, oh, right, there are all these translations available, but what aren't they what aren't they hitting? And sometimes we'll have a little bit of insight into why they're not hitting those topics. And it has to do with most printed translations just aren't trying to do what we're trying to do with this text. So as a recap, I talked about where Pirkei Avot comes from. That Pirkei Avot is part of the Mishnah, so this first collection of rabbinic statements of law intended for repetition and debate. And we spent a little bit of time talking about that the Mishnah is not there as a legal reference work. It is there as um, it is the written version of what was probably an orally recited text that people memorized, and it was structured for memorization, and preserved debates rather than preserving official statements of law. Right? So the very first big rabbinic text is one that is there to preserve debate, and the kind of the parameters of debates on different legal topics rather than um, here are the rules. Right? But that's rabbis are going to be not terribly interested in writing down collections of actual rules for a really long while. And we said that Avot is in the order of the Mishnah known as Nezikin, right? So flashing back to Passover's past, you may have at a Passover Seder done the Echad mi yodea, Echad ani yodea, who knows one, I know one. And you count up. And when you get to six, who knows six, I know six. Six are the orders of the Mishnah. So there are six kind of broad, they're orders, they're bundles of separate books of the Mishnah focused on a general group of topics. So a vote is from the order, the Seder, the order of the Mishnah known as Nizikin, which is damages, but Nizikin is law in the sense of civil and criminal law, contract law, um, witnesses, and how courts are supposed to work. And so a vote is talking about what the rabbis are supposed to be as people. And that kind of helps put it in the context of this isn't necessarily like every Jew's guide for life for the rabbis so much as it is this is this is being a rabbi. This is what you're supposed to be. And since the rabbis were judges, it makes sense to put it in the block of things that deal with law. So not quite a code of judicial conduct, but not quite not a code of judicial conduct either. Um, It's quirky. Avot is quirky because it actually is not there to preserve debate when almost everything else in the Mishnah is really there to preserve debate. It has some similarities. It's got this kind of style that's made for memorization and repetition. It is often arranged in sets of three principles, which we saw in other parts of the Mishnah. Um, and it's a little bit odd because principles from one rabbi aren't put in debate with others' principles. So very often in the Mishnah, you will see even the very first piece of the Mishnah that we have from the very beginning of the Mishnah in Mishnah Brachot. The question is, when do you recite the Shema? And we're given three answers from three different rabbis, and they can't all be right. Um, that's not what a vote does. A vote seems to just go, oh, this rabbi says blah, 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 blah. And it might offer a justification or an example or something like that, but it doesn't start making arguments in the one chunk of text the way we're seeing in other parts of rabbinic literature and other parts of the Mishnah. Um, Avot seems to be a kind of meta text about long scholars, so it's tracing authority and it's tracing lineage rather than really focusing in on what the debates are. And it lacks practical legal material. So it's not about what time do you do XYZ thing during the day. It's not about when you have this kind of situation, what are the damages that get paid? It's not about um, how we know a sukkah is valid. It's not focusing on practical stuff. It's focusing on personal principles, which is very unusual for the Mishnah to be talking about at all. They're all kind of shoved into a vote and focused on who the rabbis are and what the rabbis think. We discussed three Mishnayot. Um, so the Mishnah is the book. An individual chunk from the Mishnah is also a Mishnah. Mishnah just means repetition, so a Mishnah is a repeated statement. So we have a vote 1:1 that says Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets passed it down to the men of the great assembly, and they said three things. Be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence for or around the Torah. And we discussed a little bit about what does a fence for or around the Torah mean. And um, we talked about that being patient in judgment is not being patient in judgment of your fellow person when they run a shopping cart over your toe. It's be patient as a judge. Um, The second one we looked at was Shimon the righteous was among the last of the men of the great assembly. He used to say, the world stands upon three things, upon the Torah, upon worship at the temple, and upon deeds of loving kindness. And we talked a little bit about um, the translation that we most often see of this says deeds of loving kindness, but that's not what the word is in Hebrew. It's chasadim, and chasadim is related to chasidim, um, the idea of pietists. So this is not necessarily being kind and giving charity. This is being religiously righteous. So this is not the very beginning of Pirkei Avot necessarily saying giving to charity and bringing soup to people when they're sick and visiting them in the hospital is equivalent to the Torah and sacrificial worship at the temple for keeping the world sustained. We interpret it that way in modern times because we can, because the meaning of the word chesed and chasadim has moves around a lot, and we're not reading this in most modern contexts in the way the rabbis were writing it. So we sort of get to fudge the text a little bit. And This one is routinely fudged. And then the third one, Antigonus, a man of Soho, and the man of Soho, it's really just saying he's from a place called Soho. Received tradition from Shimon the righteous, and he used to say, don't be like workers who serve the master in expectation of receiving a reward. Rather be like workers who serve the master without expecting to receive an award, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. In other words, you're supposed to do all of this because you're supposed to do this. It's not about your personal merit and what you will receive afterward. It's because this is your job and you're commanded to do it this way. Um, sort of, we're not talking about selflessness here exactly, which is often how people kind of translate, kind of think about this. We're not talking about selflessness. We're talking about your job as a judge is to faithfully use and implement the Torah because that's your job, not because it makes you special. And that notion of individualism just isn't there in rabbinic literature in the same way that we're accustomed to thinking about it today. Um, so before we kind of move into the next, sorry about that, before we sort of move into the next section of things, were there questions about the recap slash reintroduction? Remembering that, oh, I should mention, I can't see your faces. That's how I keep everybody's faces from showing up in the video. So if you do have a question, you got to unmute or, you know, raise a virtual hand or type in the chat or whatever it is, because I won't see you. It's nothing personal. I just don't have the sense that everybody wants their face all over the internet. Okay, if anything comes up, let me know. Um, I've called this section Coming to Grips with Our Limits, and we'll kind of see why as we go through it. And when I first described this series a month or so ago, I said we'd start at the beginning and keep going. And so we've started at the beginning and we're continuing on. So we're in Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 4. And it says, Yosei son of Yoezer of Tsereda and Yosei son of Yochanan of Jerusalem received Torah from them, meaning Shimon, Antigonus, and the men of the great assembly. We're still tracing this sort of who got it from who got it from whom, who got it from whom. And we have Yosei son of Yoezer of Tsereda says, your house should be a council house for the wise, and you should be one who wrestles in the dust of their feet, and be one who drinks thirstily their words, which is pretty great imagery. What do we think this means? Or does it just seem really self-explanatory?
I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I like the humility of it. You're wrestling in the dust of their feet. I mean, I like it and I don't like it. They're the people on high who know everything. And you're
Right.
the nobody who's just gonna.
Other thoughts? There are other ways we could translate this text. So let's look at other options. So the one on the left is from Joshua Culp, his translation on Safari.org. I mentioned last time. Joshua Culp is the Rosh Yeshiva, I think, at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. So this is the um, This is the yeshiva to which all the American rabbinical students are shuttled, all the American rabbinical students from the conservative movement are shuttled off to in Jerusalem when they do their year of classwork in Israel, and is also where um, people training to become conservative rabbis or Masorti rabbis, that's the name of the conservative movement outside of the US, people training to be Masorti rabbis in Israel, this is where they go, is the conservative yeshiva. And so he is a scholar who's trained to do historical research. He's not, he's not just an Orthodox rabbi working in a yeshiva. And he says, Yosef ben Yoezer, a man of Zereda, and Yosef ben Yochanan, a man of Jerusalem, received, these are all his braces, the oral tradition from them, i.e., Shimon the righteous and Antigonus. Yosef ben Yoezer used to say, let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst. So it's a little different from the translation that I gave you in the prior slide in a couple of different ways. And then the other one, which is in the Koran Shalem Siddur, and I mentioned last time, where can you find a translation of Pirkei Avot? A conservative or Orthodox Siddur that has English translations of its text will have it. Just, regular traditional prayer books kind of format, because studying Pirkei Avot became a regular practice in the summer months during the afternoon service on Shabbat. So most conservative and Orthodox Siddurim prayer books that have a translation from Hebrew to English will have an English translation. So this is from the Koran Shalem Siddur. So this is a modern Orthodox prayer book. Yosef ben Yoetzer of Zereda and Yosef ben Yochanan of Jerusalem received the tradition from them. Yosef ben Yoezer of Zereda used to say, let your house be a meeting place for sages, sit in the dust at their feet, and with thirst drink in their words. And so there's a legitimate question to be asked. Who's right? Which one of these translations, because we've seen three now, I've given you one that says, you should be one who wrestles in the dust of their feet. And that your house should be a council house for the wise. And then you have others saying, let it be a house of meeting for the sages and sit in the dust of their feet. These are almost identical translations between the two of them. So it's a fair question to ask. Which one is it? Is any one of them right or any one of them wrong?
I mean, Rabbi, you can read Hebrew, right? So which one do you think it is?
Well, I made this translation, but just because I made this translation doesn't mean I think it's right. And
More poetic.
a little bit of that, I think I'm preserving more of the way the Hebrew is actually written, and some of the linguistic history of it. But there's nothing technically wrong with the other translations. It's more a question of what are you doing with the translation, I think. So I want to give us a different question to think about, which is where are any of us, me, Joshua Culp, the translators over at Koren, where are any of us getting any of this from? Because we tend to take a text that's in translation and we know that there's a process to translation. And we know that you can get different translations depending on your opinion about words and any number of other things. We know all of that, but then we take a translated text and we treat it like, okay, yeah, this is the text, right? And you kind of have to, right? That at a certain point, you just kind of have to say, I'm going to read this. Um, and that translation becomes the text to us, which is why everybody's used to loving kindness in that prior piece of Pirkei Avot when it's kind of saying, no, you've got to be religious. That's the world stands upon people being religious in their lives. And so the answer to the question is in part this, or I should be fair. It's not the bottle of wine or have a drink on me. It's the guy at the bottom. But when you see Bartenura stuff uh, in the wine section, it's named for this guy. There's a kosher wine named for Rabbi Ovadiah of Bartenura. So we need to know about this guy because his commentary on the Mishnah is sort of the default commentary on the Mishnah that most people use when they're functioning in the yeshiva world, which means that it's the commentary that a lot of translators rely on too. So Ovadia is a late medieval rabbi, late 1400s, early 1500s, and he's best known for his commentary on the Mishnah. He wrote other stuff, but this commentary on the Mishnah is like as close as possible to the commentary. Um, Rashi is the commentator on the Torah and on the Babylonian Talmud. And in printings of the Mishnah, Ovadia's commentary is in that same position on the page. So when you look at a volume of Talmud, the text of the Talmud is kind of in the middle of the page. And then on one side of the page, the side that is near the binding, is Rashi's commentary. The idea being you put the commentary that everyone's going to use the most toward the part of the page that's best protected from stuff getting on it from outside. Ovadia's commentary is near the spine as well. That's the kind of this is your first stop commentary location. And the company is named for his family. And yes, there is a rapper who mentioned that line in her song in 2005, which is just kind of like fun link of this long dead rabbi to modern culture that really nobody knows about. Bartonura Vineyards was the first company to use blue glass to bottle a Moscato, and it kind of got famous for that. So, why it matters? Because absolutely, you're not supposed to have heard of this guy before. Maybe you're supposed to. I don't know. But you likely have not heard of this guy before. Why does this matter? It matters because translation is a project of interpretation and commentary, and translators make choices based on the commentaries. So if you use the Jewish Publication Society translations of the Torah or the prophets or the JPS Tanakh, the translators try to apply modern biblical critical principles. They try using textual criticism to come up with a what should the verse read when there are multiple versions. When a word is obscure because it really only appears once or twice in the entire corpus of the Bible, they try to use modern scholarly techniques to reconstruct what it might mean, and they use Aramaic and they use Arabic and they use Akkadian and they use other languages to try to figure out what a thing means. But if all of that doesn't work, what the translators for JPS did was they just said, I'm going to go look at Rashi because Rashi's commentary is the most important one in Jewish tradition. And if Rashi had an answer, that was the answer they would use if modern scholarly techniques failed. In the commentaries, in the translations of the Mishnah, which means in the translations of Avot that we've looked at, Bartenura's commentary colors the translation. So when when we see them saying things like sit at the dust of their feet and drink in their words with thirst, and let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages, they're getting those ideas from Bartenura, who has pulled them forward from prior discussions and preserved them in his commentary. So this is part of the why does it matter that this commentary exists? This commentary matters because when you pick up a commercial version of this, that's what the translator read and relied on. So I mentioned this is where it is on the page. So this is a modern re-layout of the Mishnah in its traditional form. So this is the middle of the this is the Mishnah here in the middle in big text, and then this is Bartenura's commentary. The spine on this particular page is, oops, the spine on this particular page is in that spot. Um, Actually got it sitting here too. Let's see if I can. Yeah, so let's see if
Your
I can.
translation is the most literal.
So, which side am I on? Yeah, here it is. So this is the printed version of what I have on the screen. If you're looking up at my little window here, kind of looking like Kilroy with my nose above the book. And this is Bartenura's commentary, and you can see it's alongside the spine. On the facing page, Bartenura's commentary is along the spine again. And so we've got the text of that Mishnah again. Um, and I've just used my translation here for the purpose of reference. Um, and then we've got Bartenura's commentary below it that's been translated out, and it says, "Yeah, Ami."
Right, to mention that I looked at the Hebrew, and your translation was by far the most literal among the three translations that you showed us.
Yeah, I did that on purpose.
Well, okay.
I did that on purpose so that I could kind of show, hey, look what's actually going on here. Um, yeah, Ami. Oh, by the way, folks, Zoom will read your hand gestures unless you turn that off on Zoom. Um, I seem to have done it a long time ago, and I'm not sure how I did it, but I know that people sometimes struggle with Zoom suddenly like seeing you move your hand and then it does things. Um, so Bartenura says your house. This is his comment on your house. So that when wise people wish to gather there and seek counsel, your house should be prepared for this kind of thing, so that they will become accustomed to saying, let's gather at so and so's house. Since it's impossible that you won't learn some kind of word of wisdom from them. They made an analogy to a similar occurrence, entering a spice shop. Even though one might not have taken anything from it, nevertheless, a pleasant scent would cling to them and follow them out. So this is Bartenura saying, you want to make it so that smart people hang out there because you'll learn something. That's not exactly what the text says, but Bartenura is kind of saying, well, make it a place where they want to hang out and you'll learn stuff. rather than a council house for the wise, which could very literally mean, and particularly coming from the person that it's coming from, and we'll talk about that in a moment, could quite literally mean make this a place where they formally convene. And we'll talk about why that might be the case in kind of what the rabbis originally meant, or what these rabbis originally meant anyway. The next one who wrestles. Okay. The next one, Bartenura says about one who wrestles, that is to say, you should follow after them. When one walks around, they kick up dust with their feet, and one who walks after them gets covered in the dust that they kicked up. So follow the rabbis around, which is a very Greek following around Aristotle in the agora kind of thing. That we'll talk about connections to Greek culture in a different session. Another explanation is that you should sit at their feet upon the earth. Since this was the custom, the teacher would sit on a bench and the students would sit at their feet upon the ground. And it's this version of the translation, another explanation. It's this version of this explanation that's in those other translations we looked at. Sit on the ground, sit in the dust of their feet. Right? That was what those other two translations said, and that's a very common way of translating it. And it's coming straight out of Bartenura because it doesn't literally say that. It really does say, wrestle in the dust of their feet, um, based on looking at what the same roots mean in Aramaic and some other places. Um, that's not what Bartenura takes away from it, because that's not the traditional understanding of what's meant by this part of Avot. Bartenura's take on it is what's traditionally meant. And then drinks thirstily, like a thirsty person who drinks his fill, and not like an overly satiated person who ceases eating, who loathes even things that are pleasing and good. This was just color commentary, essentially. Like, I don't think there's really a big difference in terms of translation, but um, it's be enthusiastic. Somebody who eats too much and you present them with something else, they may go, oh, okay, fine. And the point is, you can never get enough Torah from these people. So take it in. Rick.
I have a question about having a commentary on the Mishnah in the 15th century. I always thought that the Talmud was the commentary on the Mishnah and the discussion of it, and it was put together much, much earlier than that. What's happened by 1450 that brought about him being sort of the guru of the Mishnah?
Yeah. So there's a few different things going on historically. So while the Talmud is a commentary and debate on the Mishnah, it doesn't actually cover everything in the Mishnah. So in terms of the total number of tractates or books in the Mishnah, um, the Talmud covers like half. It doesn't really actually cover as much as you would think, um, because the rabbis in Babylonia decided that they really didn't need to talk about agricultural stuff in the land of Israel. And they didn't really need to talk about some of these minor tractates that are about scribal issues. So there's lots to the Mishnah that has no Gemara, has no Talmud. Avot has a sorta of Talmud connected to it, called the Avot de Rabbi Natan. But Avot de Rabbi Natan is not anything like the traditional Gemara Talmud debate discussion. They're sermons on themes that appear in Pirkei Avot. So there really isn't a Talmud. There isn't a Talmud for this. There isn't a Gemara. Um, and so you do get commentaries and other things that crop up. Another thing that happens is at a certain point, people in the Jewish world start realizing that not everybody's going to go to yeshiva and learn to read the Talmud. And it's still desired that they learn text. And there becomes an order to how you learn, even if you're on your way to yeshiva. So you're going to learn Torah for a few years, and then you're going to learn Mishnah. And then after, usually around the age of bar mitzvah, that's when people go to yeshiva or go get a job, essentially. So people are studying the Mishnah separately because you only need Hebrew for that. You don't need Aramaic for it. And you don't need Aramaic to study the Talmud either, really. You don't really need competence with Aramaic as a language. You need to understand the phrases that you come across, the technical phrases you come across. So people are studying the Mishnah. And it makes sense to have commentaries that will keep people from going astray because the Mishnah has the bare bones debate and not even really the bare bones of the Talmud's debate, just like these isolated positions. And so you want people to know, okay, when you're reading all of this, here's the actual rule and a nutshell discussion of what's going on in the Talmud, which you're not reading. And so you get that in from Bartenura and other parts of his commentary on the Mishnah. So when you read the very beginning of Bartenura's commentary on the Mishnah, along with the very beginning of the Mishnah, you get a recap of the discussion in the Talmud and what Rashi says the answer is. Almost word for word, because that section happens to be in Hebrew, but there are other parts that are way more complicated. So there are commentaries on the Mishnah. There are translations of commentaries on the Mishnah. Maimonides writes a commentary on the Mishnah in Arabic, and then it gets translated into English. And for a while, it's the big commentary on the Mishnah. But Maimonides has all these other theological things going on and becomes disfavored, and that's how Bartenura gets to be the main commentary, the main commentator on the Mishnah. So it's not that it's a process of making this thing available and making a commentary available that keeps people studying in the right stream of thought. That's really what's going on with this other commentary. But because this becomes the commentary, it becomes the commentary that shapes everyone's translations when there are multiple ways of doing something, or when you want to understand what it means and you're translating for someone using a Siddur on a Saturday afternoon, and they're not going to have Bartenura and they don't really have the skills to read Bartenura. Okay, so you're going to give them what Bartenura has to say in form of a translation. So this is important. What we're seeing is important to know because as we keep reading the Avot, you're going to find me translating things differently. And much of the time it's because I make a decision like what Ami caught on to, which was that I went incredibly literal with that wrestling in the dirt thing. That was absolutely a decision on my part because I looked at it and went, well, it says that, but it doesn't say that. And I think there's a second reason for us to want to take a second look at these translations that we'll actually get to pretty soon. So, are any of the translations for 1:4 wrong? Mine or Joshua Culp's or the folks at Koren? I don't even know who the translator is. There's probably a committee over at Koren. Are any of the translations wrong? Well, they're not wrong. They're different, but they're not far off necessarily. Is Bartenura wrong? Not really. Am I wrong? Not really. I made a choice about the language of the Mishnah because we're not interested in just what's the nice thing that we want to read on Saturday afternoon in the summer in shul when it's hot, which is why the translations are the way they are, because the big translations are there for the spiritual edification of a modern person for the most part. As humanistic Jews, we do other things with this text. We want to know about the time from which Avot came. And what can the text tell us about that? And some of that has to do with how you translate a thing. Are there meanings we can find that traditional translation choices obscure? And can you learn more that way? If we see different translations, does that affect how we feel about the text? Can we take something practical from the text into our lives and work? A very kind of, you could call it ethical, you could call it political. It does depend on the text that you're looking at. We have these other concerns. We're not necessarily just what's the nice, edifying reading of this that tells us that the world as a whole depends upon the Torah, upon service at the temple, and upon us being good to each other. Not that those are, not that being good to each other isn't an important thing for the world, but that's not what that text originally says. We have additional concerns. And translating the things the way I did was an intentional choice on my part to kind of gritty the language up a little bit for us. The rabbi to whom this statement is attributed, Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer, is not a member of a high-powered group at the time that he lived. So the rabbis are around for at least 100 years before the Common Era. Some kind of proto-rabbinic group is around that long. And he's part of this kind of proto-rabbinic group. These are not people who are in political power. We know they're not because they are, by and large, seem to have been Pharisees, and Pharisees were not in political power, really, before the time of Jesus. And this is Yosef ben Yoezer is from before that point in time. So he works for a Jewish group that is not close to power. If they want to do stuff, they don't have official places to meet. This is an instruction to make it so that these people can meet and work. They need this space. They are not running the government. They're not running the temple. With the phrase wrestle in the dust, this word wrestle, which we've seen translated as sit in some of the other translation, is from our Hebrew root that means dust. So this is language that's almost like have a dust up in the dirt at their feet. It's not sit and it's not follow. It's like get dirty. And then drink thirstily, truly absorb the words. Like this is some of this language is very physical and human. And when we say, oh, just sit at their feet, because traditionally the teacher sat on the bench and you would sit on the ground in front of the teacher, misses some linguistic detail. And remember, we're concerned about linguistic detail because maybe we're missing some meanings when we just grab Bartenura and go with it. But this is a text from people who, at this point in time in the life of Yosef ben Yoezer, they are scraping by just to try to have any kind of influence at all. So this isn't just oh, yes, we're all going to get together in the courtyard of our yeshiva, and you're going to sit down in front of the rabbi, and the rabbi's going to talk, and you're going to pay attention. This is, you have to absorb every scrap of this we can give you because there's no other way we're going to be able to continue to convey what we know. And it's so important. We want you to know how important it is.
This meeting is being recorded.
This material is so important that they want you to think that they got it from Moses. Because that's how we started Avot. That Moses received the Torah at Sinai and he passed it to Joshua, who passed it to the judges, who passed it to the prophets, who passed it to the men of the great assembly, who passed it to Yosef ben Yoezer, who's telling you to sit down, to get down at his feet, and to engage and get dirty. And make him a place to study, and make him a place to make decisions. And absorb it all. Ami.
Also, although he's not saying this, but what I read into it is that he got it actually on direct lineage from God, So, and therefore, he knows what he's saying, and you learn it the way he's saying it. It doesn't give you any option here to even think about it. You just learn it.
Right. Which Ami said, look, it doesn't even really give you, it gives you the lineage. It tells you that he got it from Moses, and you have no option but to learn it just as he says it. Which is not what we tell ourselves about Jewish tradition, is it? We spend all of this time talking about Jewish tradition being about questioning and the rabbis being about asking questions, and not here. It is desperately important to Yosef ben Yoezer that you sit there and you get dirty learning what he has to say and get it right. And wrestle in the dirt at my feet and take it all in. This is not the position of a rabbi who is safe in an academy. This is something very different. Our traditional translations don't convey the physicality of any of this, right? Oh, sit in the dust at their feet. Drink it in. They're wise men sitting on a bench. It's great. It's physically and it's spiritually urgent. They want you to know that this is from Moses, which means it's from God, which means you have to listen to me. And we are on the outs, and it is desperately important that you find a way for me to do this here. And it stays important, right? This is the last point on this slide. It stays important because these become the sources for tradition, for authority for the later rabbis too, who are trying to deal with the catastrophe of the destruction of the temple. And what do we do about being Jewish? And how do we continue to have authority? This stays important, which is why this text is preserved, right? They could have found some other thing that this guy said, but they picked this. Kathy.
Yeah, given that it seems like he's watered down the language compared to your translation. And given the urgency and importance, why is the watered down language what's accepted?
Because I think there's probably a number of different reasons, but I think one of them is what people are doing with these texts just changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
So the Mishnah is the Mishnah is actually not a long text. Like the version of it that I have in Hebrew is 6 volumes long. They're not thick volumes, and most of the bulk is commentary. Like the vast majority of the bulk of this volume is commentary. The Mishnah is not actually very long. It's like this is all we can preserve right now. That's what we're writing down. And then the Talmud comes along and vastly expands on it. It's not uncommon to see sets of Talmud that are 20 volumes long and have commentary after commentary after commentary. And tradition just continues to grow these commentaries out. And it's not the same kind of urgency for this specific stuff, which seems almost crazy to say, like, wait, but people are living in these medieval kingdoms where anti-Semitism is a big deal. And it's like, yeah, anti-Semitism is a big deal, but day to day, it shapes your world, but it doesn't keep you from studying for the most part. All of that urgency is gone because the rabbis won and got to kind of run Jewish life. And people were now not living in the we have to meet in council, we have to meet in these little houses.
Right.
They're in charge, and the urgency is gone, and words continue to change what they mean, right? So when we looked at Mishnah one, Avot one, it was either 1-2 or 1-3, I can't remember which one, where it talks about um, deeds of loving kindness. That's not that translation's actually not wrong. Gemilut chasadim means deeds of loving kindness, or it can, because the word chasadim comes from chesed, and chesed means um, piety, but it can also mean loving kindness or grace or any number of other things. And so the translation changes to suit where people are as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And so is the translation sit at the dust of their feet wrong? I mean, it's not very literal. I made a choice to make a very literal translation to kind of point out that these are elemental concerns that they've packaged into this text. But it doesn't, it stops meaning that 500 years into the future from when this thing is written. And more people are studying these texts and are being exposed to rabbinic literature, and that is very different. And the urgency just isn't there and doesn't have to be there. And it changes how people see the text. Other questions? Rick?
Uh, don't leave a doc authority. And what do we take from the Mishnah? What do we take from his interpretation? And how can we do it authentically within a humanistic Judaism context?
So what do we do with Bartenura's commentary, and how do we make it work in it? How do we make this text and these translations work for humanistic Jews?
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the answer to that is you have to look at more than one translation. And I realize that there aren't a lot of translations that are doing the thing that I did with 1:4, right? Even Joshua Culp, who is a historical criticism kind of scholar of rabbinic works. He's not just an Orthodox rabbi trying to make another generation of Orthodox rabbis. That kind of translation, the kind of translation that I used, is not one that most people want, because that's not why they pick up a book that is called in English The Ethics of the Fathers, which, by the way, the name of the tractate is just Avot. It's just Fathers. Ethics of the Fathers is a thing that 20th century Jews slapped onto the thing and called it the Ethics of the Fathers. Pirkei Avot literally means chapters of the Fathers, which is fair. That's what these are. There's chapters of statements by these guys. So I think we have to have more than one translation that we're looking at. And there are not a lot of commentaries on this thing in English that are trying to do historical critical work either. The best English language one that I'm aware of is, I think, from Oxford University Press, and is like $350. It's a 3-volume book. It's several $100s. I am a big fan of buying expensive books, and expensive Jewish books at that, but I have not been able to bring myself to pay that um, yet. Um, so part of what I'm doing with this is I'm actually in the process of putting together a Google document that will have the translations that I generate for this, not because they're necessarily polished in every case, because they're not, but because they are going to tend to be a little more interested in some of the grittiness that the translations that we really do have ready access to kind of make not so gritty. So that we do have access to here's a comparison. And at some point, maybe something will happen with that, with either the Institute or I don't know. Um, and it would be interesting to see a full-fledged humanistic Jewish commentary on this as well. But one thing at a time. We're in the process of doing a commentary volume on the various Torah portions for the week. So maybe this will be next, and I can pitch it to somebody. And then we can read it and decide, okay, maybe this is relevant, maybe this isn't. Um, one thing that I think is worth thinking about is, this all of this grittiness in the text, is it relevant to thinking about resistance? Because these people were essentially resisting, or at least Yosef ben Yozer was resisting the dominant version of Judaism of his time in a lot of ways, and certainly the dominant Jewish and non-Jewish political authorities. So anyway, that's a thought, is in terms of practical use, maybe there's something there. We are at 8:01. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have questions, but we're going to go ahead and stop the recording.